Good morning, good morning. I remember the very first time I ever flew on a plane. Let me paint the picture for you. The year was 2000, I was 22 years old. I had survived the threat that was Y2K, for those of you old enough to remember what that was. And here I am flying to the other side of the ocean to do a summer internship in London. Now, oddly enough, one of the memories that has stayed with me the most from my time in the United Kingdom, it wasn't, seeing Big Ben or visiting Buckingham Palace. It was riding the tube system, which is this train network in London. And you would think for a guy that grew up in the south side of Chicago, riding a train really wouldn't be that big of a deal. Oh man, it was. You see, what made it so interesting, I was absolutely fascinated by the fact that there are all these signs and automated messages that kept repeating the same three words over and over again. Mind the gap. I remember thinking to myself, wow, people in London must be very ignorant and clueless if they actually have to be told that there's a gap from when you get on a train and step off of the train. I wasn't even from London, and I could very clearly see that there was a gap there. It was pretty obvious. Why was everybody else struggling to see something that I thought was obvious? And more importantly, why did they need to be reminded so often? It took a Londoner friend of mine to explain. She said that sometimes people can get so caught up in their own daily lives and their own issues that they can become distracted and they can ignore the gap and the dangers it represents. So they need to be reminded. I wonder, are you blind to a gap? Just like those Londoners in that tube system, we too can be blind to gaps that exist around us, blind to gaps and disparities that exist even in our own communities. Blind to gaps because they've become so commonplace, so a part of our everyday lives that we just forget that they exist. I want to do for you today what those mind the gap signs do for millions of people that travel the train system in London. I want to inform and remind you of a gap that often goes unnoticed, but if left unchecked will continue to negatively impact people's lives. The gap that I'm referring to impacted my parents' life, it impacted my life, and without you even realizing it, it's impacted your life as well. The gap that I'm referring to is the racial wealth gap that exists in America today. For hundreds of years, Black families have been denied the proper channels to create wealth and pass it on generationally, which has created a gap in wealth that now falls along racial lines. Let's talk about it. Well, how big is the gap? Well, according to a 2019 survey of consumer finance conducted by the Federal Reserve Board, the typical white household has 8 times the wealth of the typical Black household, and 5 times the wealth of the typical Hispanic household. If we look at median net worth, the median net worth for white families in the US sits at $188,200, compared to Black families whose median net worth sits at $24,100. Black families own less than 13% of the wealth that white families own. Let me put it another way. You would have to combine the net worth of 8 Black families to equal the net worth of just one typical white US household. Further data from that same survey shows that African Americans make up roughly 13% of the nation's total population, yet own less than 3% of the nation's total wealth. And these disparities in wealth continue even when you factor in things like age, education, and occupation. When discussing the injustices of the racial wealth gap amongst communities of color, economist Kuhn, Stiller, and Steins in a 2018 paper on income and wealth inequality in America said this: "The historical data reveal that no progress has been made in reducing income and wealth inequalities between Black and white households over the past 70 years. Really think about that statement. There has been no progress made since 1951. The racial wealth gap that we face is not just a black problem or a minority problem. It is an American problem. Whenever one group of our population is constrained from growing wealth and contributing to our economy, then we all suffer, and all of our growth as a country is being hindered. In 2019, McKinsey & Company did a research report titled "The Economic Impact of Closing the Racial Wealth Gap." And in this report, they found that the wealth gap has a constricting effect on the US economy, that it dampens investment in production, and that the gap is going to actually cost the US economy between $1 and $1.5 trillion between 2019 and 2028. McKinsey & Company further estimated that by closing the racial wealth gap, that we could increase US GDP by 4 to 6% by 2028. Let me put that in plain English. That's a lot of numbers and stats. What that really means is that for every man, woman, and child in America, you are missing out on literally thousands of dollars that should be in your wallets. The gap is costing all of us increased standards of living and more opportunities. So for your sake, I want to remind you, mind the gap. So why does the gap exist? And has it gotten so large and gone virtually unchanged for so long? Sometimes people will jump to conclusions and assume that the gap is the result of cultural issues facing the Black community. Well, why don't you just focus more on education? Why don't you just focus more on family? Why don't you just work harder? It's always easy to blame the people instead of confronting the problem. I want to challenge all of those assumptions today by asking you to look at this issue through a different lens. Imagine, if you would, two relay runners getting ready to start a race. The first relay runner takes off as soon as the gun goes off, pow, and they start running as fast as they can and starts passing the baton. The second runner is forced to stay at the starting gate for 5 minutes before being allowed to run. Well, the outcome is exactly what you would expect. The first runner and every runner that comes after that runner is going to be much further ahead in the race than the second runner and the people that came after them. Generational wealth and the creation of wealth works much the same way. It's a compounding domino effect. The reason we have a gap can be seen in the very structural makeup of the American economy and the policies that we've passed. You see, policies and laws can have either a positive or a negative impact on somebody's ability to create wealth. And if policies historically favor one group more than another, then it creates a bridge in creating wealth that's hard to fix. This is a hard truth, but the truth is America's economic policies have been infused with racism and discriminatory practices since its founding. And it's the compounding effect over the years of these policies that have hindered Black families from being able to create wealth. Policies, for example, like the Black Codes. The Black Codes were a strict set of state and local laws that detailed when, where, and how formerly enslaved people could work, and for how much. Policies like Jim Crow laws, which were a collection of statutes that legalized racial segregation until 1968. Discrimination in policies like the GI Bill. The GI Bill was passed after World War II to help veterans get acclimated to being citizens again. And it did this by providing them access to things like home loans, financial education, financial support, etc. But because of the way the program was structured, Black veterans did not benefit from this program nearly as much. For example, let's say you had a Black veteran and they qualified for a loan under the GI Bill. They still had to contend with racist policies like redlining. Now, maybe you've heard of redlining, but if not, don't worry, I'm going to tell you how it works. So under redlining, banks and insurers would color code maps of American cities and neighborhoods, and they denied funding, loans, and refused to sell homes to Black people and forced them to live in redlined areas of the city that they deemed poor and undesirable. They even restricted funding from going into these redlined neighborhoods and areas of the city. This process was a legally backed way to channel money and resources away from the Black community. And in my observation over my career, I've observed that many of the same neighborhoods that were formerly redline neighborhoods, look them up, they still struggle with poverty and stagnant home growth to this day. So I say again, mind the gap. So, how do we close the gap? It's a complex issue. It dates back hundreds of years and has been held in place by policies and laws that have evolved and changed with time. Maybe we do need more financial education. Now, I'm an advocate of financial education. I've been an advocate for close to 20 years, and I even started my own organization to promote the power of financial literacy. But let me be very clear. Changes in individual behavior, while needed, are not enough and will not close the racial wealth gap. The gap that we all face was created by a compounding effect of implicit racist policies. And if policies got us into this situation, then we have to turn again to systematic structural policy to help close the gap. I'd like to present you with 3 options that I believe help move us in the right direction. First, we need to create programs and policies that channel money, resources, and education into communities that have been historically hindered the proper channels for creating wealth. Now, these programs need to focus on what I call the bang for the buck issues, things that hold potential to close the gap for us. So, for example, getting more people in the African American community banked versus unbanked. So, according to research and work done by the Directors Council in their 2020 January edition of the Blueprint, we see that in Des Moines, 32% of Black Des Moines, Iowa residents are underbanked, while 22% are unbanked. Now compare that to the statewide average of 13.5% and 3% respectively. Now when you're unbanked and underbanked, that means you're more likely to utilize alternative financial products like check cashing places, payday loans, money orders, etc. By creating programs that focus on helping these individuals get banked, and we allow them the opportunity to use more traditional banking products and stop paying these predatory usury rates at these alternative lenders. A second area that we should strengthen is home ownership. We should invest more in down payment assistance, first-time home buyer programs, specifically targeting these areas and neighborhoods that were formerly redline neighborhoods. If we look at the work done in the Vacancies in Home Ownership report by the Census Bureau, we see that the current rate of home ownership for white Americans sits at 74.5%. Compared to Black households, the rate of home ownership is just 44.1%. One of the driving factors in wealth creation is home ownership, because it gives you the opportunity to take that home and the income from that home and pass it down to the next generation and pass the baton and give them a financial head start. There's one other option that I would like to let people know about. It's just one word: acknowledgement. We have to acknowledge our past and acknowledge the histories that have been done so that we can forge and create laws that counteract the negative policies and the negative laws that we've been dealing with. In her book, The Sum of Us, Heather McGee writes this statement that I love. She says, "Wealth is where history shows up in your wallet." I love that statement. I want to show you a picture of my family. This is my mother and my father, Daisy and Leon Jackson. They were born in the 1940s and grew up in the deep south of Mississippi and Arkansas. They lived through many of the same policies that I just talked to you about. History showed up in their wallets and eventually showed up in mine. It impacted the neighborhood that I grew up in, which was a formerly redline neighborhood in Chicago. I'm the first generation in my family to not pick or touch cotton since slavery. I'm the first generation in my family to go to college and get a master's degree. I'm the first generation in my family to have a real understanding of money and economics. I'm the first generation in my family to be born with all of my rights protected by law. I'm the first generation in my family to get past the baton. And it's 2021. Is closing the racial wealth gap difficult? Yes, it is. But it's possible. It's possible if we come together as a country and confront the injustices that have been done to so many of its own citizens. If we're brave enough, if we're bold enough, then we can pass laws and policies that forge a brighter future for those of us still yet to come. So I close by leaving you with just 3 very simple words. Mind the gap. Thank you.